sorry to interrupt your conversations. Good evening and a warm welcome to the last keynote of our conference, Disenchantments for Democracy. We'll continue tomorrow morning, of course. Those of you who are taking part in the conference, we have 2 sessions tomorrow morning, but this is the third and the final keynote, and thanks very much to Craig Calhoun for accepting our invitation to deliver it. Craig is president of the Berggruen Institute since last year, where he's refocusing its program, I should say, on the great transformations in our lives and our times brought about by climate change, by the restructuring of the global economy, by the new structures of politics, as well as, of course, advances in science and technology. So under his institute, in leadership, the institute seeks to connect intellectual inquiry in all these fields in the human sciences to the pursuit of practical improvements in governance and in political practice. Before his move to California, Craig was 4 years director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he remains centennial professor. He came to the LSE after a long and distinguished stint, I think of 12, 13 years, as probably the longest he says, as president of the SSRC, of the Social Science Research Council in New York, where he initiated projects which many of you may be familiar with on a wide variety of topics, from the global financial crises to understanding 9/11, to looking at the next generation of African social science, privatization of risk, humanitarian emergencies, media technology, and culture, as well as a program on improving the effectiveness of researchers' public engagement, topics which resonate well with the kind of research that we do here at the Institute in Geneva. Craig's training fits in very well with the new department which we founded here 3 years ago, Anthropology and Sociology.
This is a recruitment visit.
This is? We'll have you immediately. You can come and visit anytime. So Craig is an anthropologist and a sociologist by training. He was university professor of social sciences at the NYU, where he founded and directed the Institute for Public Knowledge. He has held visiting professorships in many, many universities, including Beijing, Berlin, Bristol, Oslo, Paris, and Khartoum. In recognition of his contribution to the social sciences, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and the Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2015, and has received many honorary doctorates, including from Erasmus University in Rotterdam and La Trobe in Melbourne. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, probably the only anthropologist to have made it there, and was named... That's true, yes. Was named an Einstein Fellow by the City of Berlin and elected president of the International Institute of Sociology. I'm just going to say a few things about 3 or 4 of his books, because I do see some students of ours here, and therefore a short reading list may be in order for this evening. Craig's research has combined critical theory and philosophy with both contemporary and historical empirical research in Britain, in France, in the US, but also China and Africa. Thematically, it has ranged broadly through social sciences, addressing issues of culture, social movements, education, religion, nationalism, capitalism, and globalization. So among the many books that he has authored, I think over 120 articles, I'm just going to mention 4 books. Neither Gods Nor Emperors was a study of the student movement behind the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing. More recently, with Emmanuel Waterstein, Randall Collins, and Michael Mann, he wrote in 2013 a book which is a bold and a very unusual book, a quintet of authors addressing the question, does capitalism have a future? It's been translated by now into 17 languages, and it considers a variety of arguments against the prevalent common sense that assumes that capitalism cannot possibly break down because there is no alternative. Each one of the authors points out that in the modern era, there have been several notable collapses, most of them unpredicted, most notably that of the Soviet bloc, all of which, most recently, all of which came to pass mainly because contemporary political elites had spectacularly failed to calculate the consequences of the processes they presumed to govern. At present, they argue, few of our elites and even fewer intellectuals can fathom an end to our current economic system. But that doesn't make it stable or resilient or robust. Wallerstein, who's among the 5 authors of the book, was among the few actually to accurately predict the end of the Soviet Union, if I remember rightly, in 1979. Wallerstein identifies in the book some fatal structural flaws in 21st century capitalism. Craig is more circumspect in the book, and he focuses our attention there on the role of politics in steering the system away, but either towards reform or towards collapse. He leaves its end open. His monograph, The Roots of Radicalism, examines the 19th century origins of modern political movements, which have often been simplified into a tale about progressive social change. The diverse social movements which he deals with are religious, political, national movements, anti-slavery movement, the pro-temperance movement, are all presented as mere strands in a unified tapestry of labor and democratic mobilization. Craig critiques this flawed view of radicalism as simply the extreme end of a single dimension of progress, and he emphasizes the coexistence of different kinds of radicalism, their tensions and their implications. The book shows the importance, interestingly, for an anthropologist, very happily so, of attachment to place and the importance of local communities, while stressing how much public recognition mattered to radical movements and how religious, cultural, and directly political as well as economic concerns motivated people to join these movements. The Roots of Radicalism thus offers compelling insights into the past that can tell us a lot, I think, about the present, from American right-wing populism to democratic upheavals in other parts of the world. His book, Nations Matter, predicted rising nationalist and populist challenges to cosmopolitanism at a time when this was not quite seen to be on the cards. And his argument was that these challenges will come about as a result of a highly unequal global economy. In it, he argued that pursuing a purely post-national politics is premature at best and possibly dangerous. So rather than wishing nationalism away, it's important that we transform it. One key is to distinguish then the ideology of nationalism as fixed and inherited identity from the development of public projects that continually remake the terms of national integration. So the book has some recipes to what should be done. So with that, Craig, I turn to you in what I hope will be an optimistic keynote after the diagnosis of populism. I hope you will tell us how we can address some of the disenchantments with democracy.
Well, I'm greatly honored by that introduction, so thank you, Shalini. I now face the challenge that everyone who prepared a PowerPoint faces. I'm committed to the talk I plan to give, so I'm afraid it won't be terribly optimistic unless you find a great deal of optimism in my saying, yes, populism and nationalism are pretty robust, and they're going to continue. That is, I guess, the message. Before I start, I want to say one other thing, given our location. One of the other SSRC projects that I initiated was the creation of an Albert Hirschman Prize and for interdisciplinary scholarship in the social sciences. So it's a pleasure to be speaking at the Albert Hirschman Center. Albert was quite an extraordinary intellectual in many, many different ways, but one of them is the extent to which he was able to trespass, as he called it, to cross the boundaries of different fields and different problem areas in social science, while continuing to have a clear-headed evaluation of questions of the quality of arguments and the extent of factual support for them. He's quite an extraordinary figure in this, and I have tried to emulate him without ever being able to write anywhere near as well. So there are weak points. Okay, let's go with this. Let me see if I can figure out how to, in fact, make it go. What's the clicker to this? I'm going to start pushing buttons randomly. No, I shouldn't do that. Do I use the keyboard?
Yes.
Okay, I can use the keyboard. That's fine. Okay, so there's an agreement. The title is the same as the one advertised. Let's go on. Populism and nationalism are hard concepts to talk about because, in fact, they aren't single concepts. They're sort of slippery, and the terms get used in different ways. And some of the confusion about these political and social phenomena comes from the extent to which they simply don't have really solid definitional structures. They are chameleon-like, and they change their meaning in different contexts. They're also particularly shaped by both being accusations at least as often as they are claims, something that Gaonkar spoke about earlier today, particularly in the case of populism. So it's a bit harder to understand the populism of people who say, I'm not a populist, I am a nationalist, right? Or I am simply an advocate for the people. And I say, that sounds populist. How do we go? Populism really is as much of a style as it is a substantive ideology. I think you get off on the wrong foot trying to understand populism if you try to pin down any ideological content to it whatsoever. It can be left-wing, it can be right-wing, it can have a variety of different contents. It is a style that is attached to different contents, or that different people are able to use in mobilizing people in one cause or another. So there may be a right-wing talk show host in the United States mobilizing people in a populist fashion for a cause. There are certain common features that has with, say, a leader of Syriza at the time of the financial crisis in Greece, but they are hardly doing exactly the same thing. But there are some important commonalities, and that's what I'm going to try to tease out today. And I also need to note this vacillation that I refer to. Some people want to try to say, oh, well, nationalism is different from nation. Of course we have nations, but not nationalism, or to make a good and bad distinction. Patriotism, that's fine. Nationalism, it's bad. My general view is that these sorts of efforts amount to squirming rather than achieving intellectual clarity. It's really hard to make these sorts of distinctions stick unilaterally. There are, of course, better and worse versions of this as of any other sort of politics, but they aren't solid in that way. And in particular, part of the character of both populism and nationalism that I will talk about is that one of the things they do is keep reproducing the underlying terms, keep us referring to the people as a basic category for legitimacy, keep us thinking in terms of nations. Michael Billig, a British scholar, talked about banal nationalism, things like postage stamps, and the extent to which in a host of similarly banal ways, the way the parade starts at the Olympics or the Eurovision Song Festival, or whatever it's called, these sorts of things reproduce an awareness, a constant sort of half-conscious awareness of being a part of nations, being in a world of nations. And we may think, I'm not a nationalist because I don't advocate policies that say my country is the best and should always benefit, but nonetheless, we tend to work that way. In addition, as I won't talk about tonight, but one of the themes in the book that Shalini mentioned, we all depend on national structures in rather more material ways. Relevant to this theme is, if you vote in national elections, if you participate in democracy in that way, it's overwhelmingly shaped by being in a world of nation states. That isn't essential to the nature of democracy, but it is the norm for democracy in our world. But also, if you travel, you need to have a passport. Other travel documents that don't identify you as a member of a nation state are inferior travel documents. So there are just a host of everyday ways in which we participate in reproducing and re-foregrounding these notions. And they are, in a way, the banal versions of what sometimes is a more striking and problematic ideological position or identity position. Populism and nationalism, in addition, are internally related to democracy. That is, it's not right to sort of say, oh, well, democracy is just working fine, but then there are these eruptions of nationalism or populism from the outside which threaten democracy, which undermine or distort democracy. There are distortions that come sometimes from people who are strongly committed to particular nationalist or populist positions, but they aren't from outside. It's part of the way in which democracy is organized in our world that there is a kind of complicit relationship with ideas about the category of the people and the fundamental importance of nations. And moreover, these tend to go together. Most of the time when people talk about peoples, they're talking about nations. Again, not essentially, but normally. Okay? So they're all sort of bundled in various ways. And therefore, you need to sort of keep your looks, or stay alert as you think about these things, because it makes it tricky to read different texts where authors use the words in different ways or make different distinctions. Now, at the bottom of this, literally at the bottom of this page, but at the bottom of the whole thing, is that democracy, I want to suggest, and I'll come back to this at the end, requires solidarity and integration. In a way, I'm making an argument against one of the intellectuals I respect most in the world, Jürgen Habermas, who has always been allergic to the idea that a strong discourse of political belonging could be important, or even more, could be progressive, particularly seen as a cultural project of nation. He sees this can only point backwards to the terrible mid-20th century history of Germany and other states. He advocates, along with some others, for thinking of the primacy of legal procedures. Charles Taylor, in his keynote yesterday, referred to the constitutional patriotism project, the idea of having a commitment not to a country as such, but to the constitutional terms, the legal structure and apparatus of the country. So it should be committed to having a good constitution and good terms. I want to suggest that this doesn't work, that it's very important that there be an understanding of political belonging, that we must recognize that this can go very bad very easily, and nonetheless recognize that some strong level of commitment of citizens to each other, as well as to the constitutional provisions of their country, is important, that some sort of location in time is important, and important among other things for what I will call the idea of projects of the nation in all of this. So the theme is that democracy isn't just politics. It depends on democratic societies. It depends on them being culturally and socially organized so that they can support democracy. Now, this does not mean they have to be highly integrist and have to be organized in a single integral structure where everybody is en bloc in the same situation as each other. But it does mean that there is a need for some account of political belonging to maintain commitment. And I think part of the crisis that we see now that gets labeled the crisis of populism in many countries, including my own, is that this understanding of common belonging, this commitment to each other, is deeply compromised. So, I'm not going to go back far in history at the beginning here. Last year, right? 2016 kicked off a huge sort of engagement with populism in the West. Now, in fact, populism, I'm going to claim, has been around all the time. It didn't start last year. It didn't come back in these forms. But Brexit and the election of Donald Trump put it on the front pages of newspapers and in the foreground of political discussion and concern for all of this. It isn't just a Western phenomenon. Populism is something that's at issue around the world, and not only with democracy, though it has a special relationship with democracy. And I want to stress, if you weren't aware of the hand signal, I take you back, right? That it's this, you need to watch for this as a key way in which people identify their alignments in this. And there are certainly left populists. As I said at the beginning, populism is not an ideology of the left or the right. A lot of what we've been concerned about in the last few years has been a wave of right-wing populisms, but at the same time, there have been more left-wing populist campaigns, as I say, using different hand gestures. Populism and nationalism are newly prominent today. They are newly prominent today again. Another little-known fact, along with the hand signal, but this time true, is that Donald Trump paid $100,000 to acquire the rights to the slogan, "Make America Great Again," which was the slogan of Reagan's campaign, after which it was sold to an investor who held it until selling it to Donald Trump to use in his campaign. It's a copyrighted brand slogan. Now, Reagan ran much the same sort of campaign, and in many ways is a very populist candidate. And some of the features of populism as a rhetorical style, I called it a style before, are things like finding everyday, homely ways to talk about phenomena which are normally understood in more complex systemic or statistical terms. I'll just pause on that for a moment. I'll give you a Ronald Reagan example of this. Ronald Reagan famously said, actually Donald Trump cited him once during the campaign for this, Ronald Reagan famously said, "Balancing the federal budget is just like balancing your family checkbook." Now, it's actually not. Right? The federal government is allowed to print more money. You're not. There are other important differences. They're allowed to run deficits, right? There are a whole series of things that are different. But it gives in Habermasian terms, a life world, an everyday, immediate, close-to-hand way of understanding something that is more distant, a bit more threatening because of the distance, and commonly understood on the basis of expert testimony or explanations. Economists give you accounts of what's going on with balancing the federal budget, and they don't sound anything like how you balance your family budget. The phenomenon of trying to reduce complex systemic issues to everyday, close-to-home understandings, despite the loss of meaning, is an important feature of what get called populist movements. They are trying to appeal to the people and to present clarity in that, but they are also responding to a world in which we are enmeshed in these enormous, large-scale systems that are in various ways problematic. Even when they're working well, we often find it frustrating or terrifying to think about the ways in which our lives are dependent on very large-scale, complex systems of social integration, of infrastructure. So we fly around the world in airplanes, or we send messages on email or other systems. And if you start thinking about all the systems of interdependence, you very quickly realize this huge amount of it. And then you think, how many of those could be disrupted by terrorists? Well, gee, a lot of them. The water system, actually, or the transport system, or right? How many of them could be disrupted by hackers? Right? Well, a lot of them, as it turns out, and more of them depend on artificial intelligence or other computer software that could potentially be hacked, so that it, I don't know about your water system, but mine in Los Angeles does, in fact, have a component of artificial intelligence doing flow management through the system. If we move to driverless cars, there are more opportunities for this. Now, I'm not saying this is all bad. I think most of it produces things we like. This is why we keep doing it. We like having our iPods and being able to listen to music. We like being able to communicate with our friends who are somewhere else, our family members, by computer technology. It's not that it's bad. It's that if you think of it under the guise of its genuine systemic complexities and vulnerabilities, it's a bit threatening. So managing the relationship between these enormous complex systems and our everyday lives is important. Now, one way in which this gets managed is the government works on it. And the government employs experts, graduates of this institute and others, to organize and manage those complex systems, to check on it. I, for example, don't know very much about aeronautics, but felt reasonably safe while flying here. exhausted, but safe. All right? That's not because I checked up on the aircraft before I flew. It's because I'm confident that a mixture of insurance companies and government agencies and intergovernmental agencies do enough checking to determine that the planes are safe to fly. Okay? But if you begin to doubt that, if you think experts, right, are biased against the ordinary person, you don't want to rely on expert opinion. Or if, as is really the case, the insurance company is much more interested in making money than it is in keeping you safe, then you begin to have some doubts. Right? So one way in which, the main way in which we manage the relationships between complex systems in everyday life is we build organizations and institutions to do that for us, governments most importantly, but also others. But another way we manage it is by trying to change, by evoking ways of thinking, by believing in ideologies or understandings of the world that simplify this. I'll come back to a bit of that. But first, let me just point out, right, with Ronald Reagan, that there is a return. There was a discussion earlier at one of the sessions of the conference about a cyclical phenomenon. I actually don't think populism and nationalism are necessarily cyclical, but they are certainly recurrent, and they certainly aren't new. All right, so William Jennings Bryan, one of the great figures of American agrarian populism, the end of the 19th century, with his slogans, no cross of gold, right? No crown of thorns, making a religious link there to a comment on finance capital, right? This was a farmers' movement that was centrally organized in relationship to the growing financialization of things that affected farmers at the time. It's not the only sort of movement. That's actually him, again, on the right there, with Eva Perón. I want you to notice the hand gestures. Again, none of this stuff, right? The sort of embracing is a more common populist hand gesture in that respect. And there are lots of historical examples on the far right, on the left, and in other ways. Populism is a recurrent theme in political mobilization and has come in many ways more so through modernity. So as we have more countries that are organized in terms of having their legitimacy be the service of the government to the people, having their constitutional structure recognize the people as sovereign in the country, we have a reliance on a kind of rhetoric of the people and populism. It's always there in the background. It occasionally moves into the foreground. And what I mean by being more extreme in this is being more of a sort of trump card against other ideas, right? So it's not, do you have the idea or not? It's, do you think, oh yeah, this is one of things. How well we are doing as a country, the national good, the sort of popular well-being of the country, is one value along with several other values. Or do you construct it as the paramount, primary one? Or do you construct it in terms that make it a strongly racialist concept? And so there are ways in which it becomes extreme, belligerent, and more conflict-ridden. As a rhetoric, as a way of organizing, populism is almost entirely associated with protest movements, not large-scale reconstruction. I say almost, there are examples. Today, there was a paper that discussed Gandhi as a populist who I think would have to be credited with engaging constructively in using a category of the people in his work on India's future and India's independence. But in general, populism is a matter of protest movements. It's very well geared to protest movements, and the protest movements sometimes help to set an agenda, right, to put an issue for the public, even though they don't include the policy that will do it. Demagogues are key. Without people who look a bit like Pepe Grillo, populism would be not only less strong, but less fun. Demagogues are manipulators of popular sentiments. They provide the vocabularies and the arguments, but we need to think about them a bit more. There are a lot of familiar demagogues in our current era in various ways. And here, you see the hand signal. Marine Le Pen is trying to deceive you into thinking she's a left-wing populist by putting her arms out. Boris is just making it. And Donald doesn't really need the hand signal because you can just look at him and know what he stands for. Right? Followers are just as important. Right? A misleading feature of a lot of discussion about populism and politics is that it focuses very heavily on the leaders, on what the leaders have to say, not on the phenomenon that the leaders are finding followers. And the followers are interesting and significant, not this group in particular, but followers in general, because they often precede the leaders. That populist sentiments and populist networking and populist discussions will spread, and there will be, in effect, a competition to become the spokesperson for the populist movement. And the spokesperson, the leader, Trump, whoever else, plays a big role because they help to give the movement larger scale. Typically, the conversations that go into populist politics are relatively local conversations. And most populist movements don't have organizational structures or their own media outlets to become large scale, to work at the scale of whole countries. They are relatively local, but then demagogues, then a few political figures fill the function of scaling up the populist movement. And it's been this way through the 19th century into the present day. It's a long-standing feature of this, that many sorts of mobilizations, when people are frustrated, when farmers are upset because the changes in the terms of credit are making them lose their farms, right? This doesn't mean that they have an effective national organization with a secretariat and its own communication system, all of this. They are relatively dispersed. There are people who become entrepreneurs of populism who gather together and help establish that communication. So that's a positive role of communicating. It's different from having an organizational structure, though, and it creates a vulnerability to be misled, in some cases a vulnerability to certain kinds of attacks, like hacking and so forth. It's also important, in addition to the demagogues, the followers, to think of some features of modern society. I've already brought this up by saying something about the large-scale systemic world. Populism is a response, in part, to this world of large-scale systems and their periodic failures and frustrations. Large-scale is often forgotten by social scientists. Right? We'll write about countries without much regard to how big or small they are. The language of nationalism is peculiarly inattentive to this. Luxembourg and San Marino are described the same way as the People's Republic of China. They are nations. They have the same diplomatic standing when ambassadors are exchanged and so forth. But of course, they're really not very similar. People's Republic of China is not just a little bit bigger. Right? There's a fantastic difference. Right? Nationalism, as a rhetoric, works in some part to obscure this difference to us and to tell us each country has the same standing, a little bit like each individual has the same rights in a society. Populism responds to the reality of very large scale, the fact that our democratic societies are societies of strangers, that even relatively small societies are not direct extensions of family. We use the language of family so that people will use the language of brotherhood to talk about their fellow citizens sometimes. But in fact, it's not family. And that somewhat misleads us to think that common descent, descending from the same people biologically, is the way that nations were formed. But it's not. It's not in any case at all. It's a little more true. It accounts for somewhat more of the variance in some cases, certain small nations than others. Right? Common descent explains more of Norwegian identity than it does of American identity, but it doesn't really explain all of Norwegian identity either. It's not that all the Norwegians gather at Sunday dinner together, right? All 3.5 million of them or something. It's still large-scale integration, right? But it's also the case that it depends on media, and it depends, again, on various systems. So to knit together a nation, to create a people, is a response to this scale, and the scale of our societies that shapes things. This is also part of what makes direct democracy a really challenging project and reshapes democracy in the direction of representative and other systems in most large societies. Modern societies are also complex in important ways. Populists tend to hate experts. The Brexit campaign, the campaign to take the UK out of the EU, was in part a campaign against experts, which People like William Gove said, we no longer need experts, nobody wants experts, right? And evoked a society that wouldn't have experts. The fact that he was the Minister of Education made it a peculiar sort of a call, but nonetheless, right, it's not without resonance. Right? There's a lot of resentment of experts and of elites in various ways. But the experts are there, whether they're good at what they do or not, because of the complexity of systems. You really do want an expert checking the safety of the airplane before you fly. And of course, everybody who says they're against experts knows that and wants an expert to check the airplane before they fly. That's not quite the issue, but it's a basic concern. And it goes again to the way in which we are knit into societies and how much difference there is between the ways in which we have face-to-face and direct relationships with other people, with friends and families, and in local communities and neighborhoods, which are in many ways relationships that we value and we like to take as models of good relationships, how different that is from being connected into these very large-scale systems that are reliant on intermediaries and expert knowledge, formalized knowledge. You can't understand them if you don't have a degree. You can't understand them if you don't have an advanced degree in just the right subject. Right? We create a world that is very difficult for anyone to fully understand. Right? If by fully understand you mean being able to second guess your doctor when he tells you what medicine to take, to second guess the airline pilot when he runs the airplane, to second guess the hydraulic engineers who manage the water systems and so forth. We simply require the experts. Right? Modern societies are plural and differentiated. All of them, even relatively homogeneous ones like Norway, are plural. They're internally differentiated, they have different cultures, and therefore they have issues about how to bring cultures together. And of course, Norway has immigrants, like every other European society. They're unequal, much more unequal now. And they are what I've called here direct access. This is a term that Charles Taylor introduced to replace a term that I had previously introduced, and it's better, so I'm going to use it for this. They are societies in which everyone in principle can speak directly to each other, including directly to power, in which they are not structured by layers of intermediate organization. There may be some layers, like local community, but you don't have to go to the leader of your local community if you want to reach the national government. There's a direct access. This makes media extremely important. They govern it. Okay, now I've given you my disclaimers and background. Let's go to some more of this. Nationalism, populism are always available. They can be used. And nationalism and the people, the nation and the people, both work as categorical identities, in which everybody's in a category together rather than relational identities most of the time. They are not like kinship. Right? If you want to say everybody you're related to, you have to say, well, I've got my brothers and my sisters, and then my brother-in-law, and then I've got a cousin over here, and you eventually have a bunch of relationships, and on the basis of those, your cousin's married to somebody, so now you're related to her, and she has a father, so now you're related to him, but more distantly, right? But the categories, nation or people, posit individuals, right? Everybody is directly a member as an individual, right? And equivalently a member as individuals. This is, by the way, for the social scientists in the crowd, a version of Durkheim's old discussion of mechanical and organic solidarity. The idea that a challenge for modern societies is that simply being in the same group by ideas or culture won't be enough to knit together complex, highly differentiated modern societies. Right? That organic societies would need something else. Constitutional patriotism? I'm not sure. But something to do it. We have the idea of common culture. It's important. Is it enough when we are so complex and plural and differentiated in all of this? Populism is in part the assertion that it is, with some qualifications and footnotes, that being a part of the people is self-explanatory, transparent, and manages your identity and your relations to all the others. Huge amount of legitimacy is claimed by the idea of people in all of this. And that's not all bad, right? People do good things with this. The notion of we the people in the US Constitution is a central part of political belonging. And the story that I'm telling is one in which democracy depends on political belonging, not only good laws. It depends on wanting to be in the society with the other people in the society and organizing life together. But we the people isn't something that is established once and for all. There's a constitutional founding moment. Right? So the American founders gather, they write the Constitution, they ratify the Constitution, right? And it goes back to state legislatures as a moment of founding. That's actually quite important to the making of American society. But the making goes on for another 200 and some odd years, right? We the people changes. This is part of what I mean by the project there. That for your founders, African Americans aren't fully included, women aren't fully included, right? There are a variety of restrictions on citizenship, right? In which Switzerland has its own story of the issue of women and voting and all of this. The point is that the idea that we just inherit our nations is belied by the extent to which we change them and recreate them and remake them ourselves all the time. That every country's history shows versions of this, sometimes disastrous steps that have to be corrected then, but it shows versions of it. And the migration of today is potentially another such version. It's not a contradiction to an obvious and necessary cultural unity, right? It is a question of whether there can be a further project of integrating migrants. Social change, a further project of integrating new ideas, new relationships, say gender roles. One of the commonalities of many of the right-wing populist movements in the world today, and most of the right-wing nationalist movements, is that they are horrible on gender rights. They're horrible on sexuality, right? They are as bothered by women's rights as they are by migrant rights, which is interesting because you begin to think you grasp the logic. Oh, they're worried about immigrants because there's a competition, right? They're not part of the nation, right? Well, right, is it the same for wanting to restrict women's rights or wanting to restrict the rights of gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual people and so forth? Well, there's an issue in all of this in which there is an opportunity to remake national belonging so that it is more inclusive. But there's no guarantee this will work, right? It's actually a project. It can fail. It can never be tried, right? It may or may not work in all of this. And the continuing relevance of ideas like popular sovereignty in all of this and its ability to organize a democratic relation to the state depends on success in those reworkings. If it's not possible to keep renewing the meaning of common belonging, then there is a problem, a deep problem for democracy. If it's not possible to achieve it, say at the level of the EU, then there's a problem. And that's one of the questions for the EU in all of this. So nations are not just inherited. Nationalist ideologues tend to present them that way. They're always already there. You just recognize them and you ignore all those acts of the past. Historians spend lots of their time trying to correct nationalist ideologues. No, France wasn't always Catholic. They actually had to kick out some of the Protestants to make it that way. This sort of thing goes on all the time in a tension between professional academic historians and nationalist politicians and others. So nations are potential projects. Now, what are potential projects? Right? There are a lot of them. Good example, the UK found lots of the meaning of being British in the British Empire for a long time. Held together Scotland, for example, with England, in part by the disproportionate role of Scots in running the army and the imperial administration, right? And believing in that great British Empire, sun never sets on the British Empire, and so forth. When decolonization, right, ended the empire, not all at once, but over a period of years, in the middle of the 20th century, it helped Britain that it embarked on another national project, the project of building a welfare state, creating the National Health Service, creating the BBC, right? Transforming the Church of England, actually, by William Temple, in a variety of ways, a national project of creating and transforming institutions to make a better Britain, not by conquering other countries somewhere, but by building institutions, and institutions that would integrate the country, that would integrate the different nations that are a part of the multinational state of the United Kingdom in that sense. So building welfare states. The same thing worked in much of Europe after the war, right? That a project of remaking the nation, of remaking Germany, for example, not by echoing the accounts of Germanness that had been circulating in the 30s and 40s, but by building new institutions, including welfare state institutions, was the way in which Germany became a successful society with a new account of what it means to be German. And then there are challengers today. The AfD and others are saying, oh, well, we don't have to be restricted to this new set of vocabulary and new institutions. We can evoke the older ways of talking about Germanness. Issues of integration are important. One of the biggest acts of trying to integrate the United States was building a superhighway system. The interstate highway system in the United States that President Eisenhower put in place, initially inspired by thinking about troop movements and defending the West Coast, made it possible to move around the United States. Well, it builds on railroads that were there before, and it continues on to other things. Transport and communications are ways of integrating the country. This is one of the reasons governments invest in these technologies, in these infrastructures, to be able to integrate the country in all those ways. But also things like rural electrification. Most modern developed countries, and especially democracies, have made a point of ensuring that the access of people in remote areas to telephones, to electricity, to other technological systems is pretty much the same as those in urban areas. Right? Maybe not exactly, because there are some geographical impediments, but at considerable cost. So every European country committed to delivering the post, in the post-war era, to rural citizens of the country, charging them the same price for a postage stamp as people in cities were charged, even though the costs were sometimes 10 or 15 times greater per letter delivered. Okay? It was seen as part of integrating the country. If the country had sort of applied full citizenship to the people in an urban center and only reduced forms of it at a distance, it wouldn't hold together in the same way. And there are lots of versions of this in various areas. The US, the famous TVA is part of this. But also acts of inclusion. Right? In the United States history, making African Americans full citizens of the United States, making the former slaves and their descendants full citizens, making immigrants full citizens, right? But a whole series of people have been treated as others, women perhaps most glaringly, and required a project of integrating them fully. And then the steps in that project. So women are brought into politics, so they're brought fully into economic opportunities. Well, there's another step in the project and so forth. In some cases, Canada and Norway are among the few that I know, part of the national identity, the national project, is to try to be a good country on the global scene. Now, without pausing to praise Canada and Norway, I would just like to point out that what it means is that that can be an objective of a country. We don't have to think of nations and nation states as intrinsically opposed to international cooperation, as though every time you cooperate, you give up something to your country. It can be one of your goals as a country that the world should work better, right? For example, to deal with climate change. You know you can't do it all by yourselves. You need cooperation. It's a national goal. Cooperating is a national goal. It's not a sacrifice of nationhood. Right? Now, populists often speak in terms of grievances. Populism is heavily in a rhetoric of resentment and grievances. But the grievances are interestingly shaped by successes of these national projects, not just failures. For example, the very egalitarian inclusion that I was just talking about produces resentments. Right? Oh, well, women get jobs now. That's why I didn't get a promotion. Right? Oh, well, they had to make an allowance for black people. That's why X, X, X. Right? So there are lots of resentments that come from the very success of the national projects that others embrace, like trying to create greater equality, that helped shape some of this. And there is also egalitarian inclusion that upsets what had been comfortable and more secure understandings of the local community. You'll remember that I said that there's the community, the everyday, the life world, the not critically reflected sense of membership is very important to people. And it's unsettling when the norms and rules change. Right? It's like trying to explain transgender identity to your grandmother. And this doesn't mean she can't get it, but she might not get it on the first try. And this sort of change, right? But then add in, well, how many languages can we have in the country? Well, how many currencies? Could we have this? Could we have that? Is it necessary, right? Is it necessary to have our own national currency? Right? A lot of people in Germany found it really hard to give up the mark for the euro. The changes that upset what are essentially defensive solidarities that keep us anchored in the world, are difficult. But this sense, I think the strongest sense of this applies to the gender, race, immigrants group, is the perceived unfairness of being pushed to the back of a queue, a metaphor from Arlie Hochschild in her account of people in Louisiana who became supporters of Trump and the Tea Party. That they thought, hey, they were working hard. They knew that some other people got ahead of them. They were willing to say some other people were smarter, and that's why they got university degrees and got better jobs. And there were other people who worked hard, and that's why they made money. And they saved more. They didn't spend it all. That's why they could own their own house. But when they felt that other people were being moved in the queue in front of them, by affirmative action policies at universities or by other ways of preferential treatment, or just because they worked harder or came in other ways, then there was a resentment of frustration. The single most important thing she heard from these populists about why they were populists was their sense that they had been doing the right things, the things they were told were the right things to do. Go to school, work hard at your job, and they were not getting ahead. They were not realizing the American dream. Their houses were being repossessed. Right? They were losing their jobs. There were toxic wastes in the water supply, right? And they weren't getting some of the new opportunities that they could see on TV existed for other people. Okay? Now, at a systems level, we could start saying, well, look, the fact that we now have more immigrants is not why there's toxic waste in the water supply. That has to do with the chemical company down the road. But the perception, the sense of being held back after doing what you were supposed to do is widespread. And different versions of this, I think, are powerful in many places around the world. Not just in America, which has always had a strong idea of social mobility, but which has seen social mobility almost vanish. There's almost no interclass social mobility in the United States anymore, which is a shocking change in the United States. Now, I will tell you, this has almost nothing to do with immigrants, and I'm pretty sure I'm right? It has mainly to do with other features of the economy and why there is a hollowing out of middle-class jobs, right? But it nonetheless creates an issue. But then there have also been failures. People aren't just frustrated by successes. They're frustrated by a variety of failures. They may or may not have good analyses of them. Populists typically do not write long analytic books about the various things that concern them. And they may get things wrong and be misled by their demagogues or other leaders. But there are big issues. There really has been a massive consequence to deindustrialization, not just in the United States, in Britain, in other countries. It's not just are things getting made anymore, can you buy them somewhere, but it's a changing geography of where they're getting made in which some local communities are deeply damaged. Right? And it's a changing set of opportunities for how this works. It's an erosion of what had been good jobs, right, with relatively fewer opportunities. Financialization is like this. In the mid-1970s, about a quarter of the wealth in the OECD countries, in the richer countries of the world, was held in the form of financial assets, bonds or something like that. By the time of the financial crisis, 7 or 8 years ago, it had reached 75%, from 25% to 75%, pretty much inverting the ratio, and it stayed at about that level. It hasn't declined very significantly. Right? So a huge amount of wealth is held in the form of financial assets. Now, if you're like most people, and like me, most of you say, so what, or something, you are actually not worried about that. It doesn't affect your life world. You want to know whether you can buy a car or a house or send your kids to college, right? But in fact, it does affect that. To have the amount of that money looking for opportunities, like lending people money to buy their houses in order to make more money, and then creating the conditions for the financial crisis, does affect people, even if they don't have a systemic. They aren't economists. They don't write systemic analyses of that. So financialization's had a huge impact. Perhaps the biggest impact is the extent to which it speeded globalization, because easily transferable financial assets were extremely important to that. But it's a factor. Inequality is a factor. The dramatic growth in domestic inequality in most of the well-off countries of the world is a huge issue. It's a huge issue in China, which is becoming a little bit more well-off, not very, but which has also, during its development, brought millions of people out of poverty, but still seen a net increase in inequality compared to the earlier communist years in China and all of this. So there are these major policy figures that have shaped our world and all of that. It's also a range of complex external threats. Right? If you understand nationalism through an idea of absolute perfect autonomous sovereignty, then it's sort of hard to figure out how to organize global cooperation. But in fact, nations are always deeply connected to each other. Back in the 18th century, in the early years of modern nationalism, it was international relations that forced nationalism in many ways on different countries, that created the pressure for a transformation from the earlier monarchical systems and so forth. But in any case, we are in a highly international world. Capitalism connects us all together. It connects us partly in good above-the-board trade and partly in the production of tax havens, tax shelters, and illicit capitalism. About a quarter, it's really hard to get a good measure of this, but reliable estimates, about a quarter of all of global capitalist trade is illegal in some part of its circuit. Right? Might be illegal in the receiving country, but legal in the sending country. There are various ways in which this can play out. Trafficking, right? In guns, in drugs, in people, right? There is a huge economy of trafficking. The mingling of the money from this with people who are, savings of people who are just avoiding taxes, it's a big issue. Enormous amounts of capital. And it affects you and me and everybody else because it's not taxed, right? And therefore, there is not money available for the government to be able to provide public services when you hear about fiscal austerity. That's one of the sources of it. And it isn't measured, right, in various ways. And it is often available to finance some very questionable enterprises. So there are a variety of complex issues. I don't want to sort of go into turning this into an international relations talk. Just there really are challenges in the world. For populists, the outside world is often interpreted just as threatening, right? But even if that's overstated, it's a challenging world. There are these things going on. States really do struggle to meet huge challenges of various kinds, from global warming to the drug trade to terrorism, or let's take the attacks, the cyber attacks of the lower right, right? That map of all of those color vectors is just the map of cyber attacks in one 24-hour period, right? They're mostly unsuccessful. They're thwarted by antivirus software or other kinds of things, but you get the idea. There's a vulnerability that has to be worked on. Now here's another issue that comes with that. I'll try to explain fairly briefly. What I've called extended distinction hierarchies. This is a nod to Pierre Bourdieu, but let me be sort of brief about it. Many of you will remember Pierre Bourdieu's work on distinction, which really extends Max Weber's idea of status hierarchies and points out that people don't just have more or less money, they have more or less status, they have more or less respect from peers, they have more or less cultural influence and so forth. We'll extend that, just think of distinction hierarchies more generally, ways of getting ahead, anything that can be organized hierarchically, from having more money to having more prestige to having more fashionable clothes to knowing which wines will travel and which really have to be drunk in the country of origin. Okay? Now, there are hierarchies. almost every hierarchy of distinction that you can think of got stretched, extended, elongated in the decades since 1975. Do you like single malt scotch? Right. Well, the number of different single malt scotches, right? First off, single malt scotch was barely sold in 1975. It was not a thing, right? There existed 2 or 3 brands, right? But almost all the single malt scotches were put into blends, and Prestige Scotch was blends, Chivas Regal or something like that. Right? Single malt started being a thing, and they became a bigger thing with, you know, 10-year-old wasn't good enough. It should be a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 21-year-old, right? I was given a gift that made me realize the threat of corruption when I was the head of the LSE, in which an alumnus gave me a gift of a bottle of scotch that he said was really special, and I thought that was really nice. And I drank it, and I thought it was really nice, and I went to the store to get myself more of this. But it was 185 pounds per bottle, right? There is a huge scale of this. Until we all just had iPhones, camera equipment, stereo equipment, cars, everything that you can think of as a consumer good has this kind of scale. Buying clothes, you can just buy a shirt, or you can buy a shirt for $400 that is a designer shirt that has some significance in all of this. They're positional goods, in part, what economists call positional goods, meaning that their value derives not on what they are intrinsically. The expensive shirt doesn't keep you warmer, right? It derives from being fancier, more expensive, higher in the system, right? When people who make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, or hundreds of thousands of euros, or francs, right, want raises, it's mostly not to be able to buy something else, right? It's mostly to be able to make more than the person down the corridor. And that continues all the way up into the ranks of billionaires and their desire to be more powerful, richer, higher in the Forbes list, and so forth. But this isn't just funny, right? It has a huge impact on people. One of the places it's happened, for example, is universities. I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'll have to remember to skip that when I get to that, right? But the higher education system, right? Since 1975, there has been an elongating of the prestige hierarchy of universities. Now, I'll give you the American examples, which are in this, as in many other cases, extreme. And many countries in Europe have resisted the same sort of phenomenon, but none have resisted it completely. And most countries in Europe had some project of joining. So let me just use the university example, since many of us have university connections. Right? The distance between getting a degree from Harvard and getting a degree from California State University at Northridge, or a far less prestigious university in a more obscure location. It's always there. Harvard was always higher. The distance in expected income for your life, in the chances of what kind of first job you would get, in whether you could go to graduate school, all of these things change. Right? I'm going to bet that the Cal State Northridge graduate just has a really hard time getting into this institute, no matter how hard she studied. And the Harvard graduate has an easier time, right? This kind of stretching the prestige hierarchy is enormous. There's a shift towards private universities and private money in the United States. Not so much in Europe, although not totally absent, since the spread of private business schools and other things has affected people on this continent as well, right? Governments often initially thought, well, we don't do that here. We can't charge tuition fees. We can't start competing in this way, and we aren't into that prestige hierarchy. Every region has their own university, and they're all the same, right? But it only takes one. It only takes ETH to start saying, well, we're going to compete, when it's then a problem for Geneva or a problem for Zurich that ETH is getting more prestige, and they can go to the government and say, hey, we have Nobel laureates, and we have this, and we just hired that person, and right? And there's a competitive system that begins to produce hierarchy in greater amounts. And then in Germany, they say, well, why don't we have universities that are more highly ranked? British and American universities completely dominate the rankings of universities, but we have good universities here. What's going on? Well, Germany has a very flat university system, basically structured among the Länder in a way that doesn't create individual centers of excellence, and then it set up, actually, a decade ago, a government policy of trying to do that and start giving money out from the federal government in order to try to create some places that were better than others. Not in order to do better science, in order to create some universities that were better than others so that they could succeed in the rankings, right? Which is an example of this extended distinction hierarchy, right? The rankings matter more, they get longer in various ways. It affects faculty members who declare politically, I'm absolutely against this. I think this rankings business is outrageous, until they get the big offer from Cambridge, and then they go, right? So it's a pernicious system, denounced by most of its participants, that enmeshes us in it, and for most people who are not part of the elite, keeps them permanently out of it. They go to university thinking, I've done the right thing, I've worked hard, I'm going to university. Here I am at Southern Louisiana, I'm getting a degree, this is going to make me a part of the successful middle class. But it doesn't, because that's not a very marketable degree. And to the extent it's marketable, it's local. It's not a national or international market. It's a local market. And one of the things about these extended distinction hierarchies is more and more of them are partially global. In more and more occupations and in other arenas, the top-end positions are for cosmopolitan people who are able to get credentials that are appropriate and circulate globally and mix with their fellow cosmopolitan elites, right? But that only leaves the others locked out more of the system, say their fellow citizens in this. Now, there's more of the story. I'm going to skip on from the universities and all of that, but think about that. And here's an application to immigrants, just to push the point of why I think these distinction hierarchies are so important. The common story about populists not liking immigrants is the immigrants are poor and they're going to need welfare payments from the government. That's going to take our tax money, and the immigrants are going to compete for working class jobs. And so that will be bad for us, and the immigrants are going to commit crimes. Now, we can debate whether any or all of these are true and how true they are and how long they last and other things about that. The answer is probably not zero and not as much as populist ideologues think, right? But the point that I want to make is it's a misleading picture of immigrants that misses this queuing effect, because more and more immigrants are in fact highly skilled. And they come with families that are highly motivated, and they succeed in universities. So Chinese immigrants in the United States do far better than the typical American in school, employment, and earnings. They fulfill the American dream much faster than black or white Americans who may have been in the country for generations. Okay? This is why you get complicated questions, like can Harvard reserve some places for white and black Americans, or does it have to give all the places to Chinese and Indian people, who on the basis of test scores would probably earn most of the places? All right, so there's a lawsuit now financed by a right-wing populist group from an Indian American who wasn't accepted to Harvard over the idea that Harvard says they want a diverse student body, which will include a mix of different races and ethnicities. So you get my point that this thing comes around. It comes around in part because there are Indian and Chinese people in the upper ends of these distinction hierarchies who can afford to move to America, can afford to come to America as pregnancy tourists, have babies, the kind of thing that outrages Donald Trump, right? It's legal, but it shouldn't be, right? Those babies are citizens. They can then apply to universities 18 years later and attend them, right? There is a significant global flow of the well-educated and well-off towards the rich countries. The biggest global migration flow is not poor people to the rich countries, it's rich people to the rich countries. And those rich people get ahead faster than the indigenous middle class or working class people. So you have indigenous working class people who feel that they're not getting what they should get. Their kids aren't getting into the university, or they're not getting the job promotion. But that story is less about competition with poor immigrants than it is the role of well-off immigrants, including in many countries where you can actually buy your way into the country in various ways. Right? So this is what I mean by the fact that the globalization, right, isn't just an even spreading, it's creating these extended hierarchies, and they're having an impact on this, and they're part of what creates populism in all of this. So is rapid social change, the blockage of social mobility that I talked about, unequal geography, right? Unequal geography is worth pausing on to underscore, and then I'll move on, right? Countries, this is nationalism and nationalist thinking, may get richer. You may say, okay, there's been a 6% increase in the gross national product, gross domestic product, right? How it's distributed is crucial. Some countries have very strong policies for making sure every region benefits. Others don't. One of the biggest issues in the US election, right, not Russian hacking, not why didn't Hillary campaign in Wisconsin, is the geography of benefit from globalization. Right, the simple geography of it. There are reasons why New York and California and the whole West Coast, blue states, as we say in the United States, the South is red. It's only part of the story, but it's significant. There are a whole series of ways which this went on, and these are things in which elites are complicit. So many of us, elites, tend to look at the people who hate elites and say, what's wrong with them? They don't understand how important we are to the world. We make everything work. They need us. Why don't they realize they need us? But part of what they recognize is that the decision-making that we engage in has often served the economy as a kind of abstraction with its GDPs and so forth, and not served ordinary people. Right? It has not created popular prosperity. It has created growth in the economy and at large in various ways. But there are also some very specific things that tend to put groups apart from each other. I'm going to give you another American example, and actually this one I know does not have a direct Swiss analog. It has an analog in some other countries, but not Switzerland. During the Vietnam War, a generally bad, misguided thing, right? When I was a student, young in America, every college student knew somebody who died in Vietnam. Everybody knew they were at risk of being drafted. Right? There were campaigns, though, to say that the military should not recruit on campus, and we should create a distance between us pure intellectuals and the military. And they succeeded to a very large extent. And now almost no undergraduates or graduate students at any of America's elite universities know anybody who's died in Iraq, even though the numbers of deaths are comparable. There are large numbers of deaths. The war has dragged on for a long time. The war is fought almost entirely by people who need the job. Immigrants, right? Black Americans, rural whites, right? People for whom it is an economically advantageous job, who are not Yale students for the most part. There are a few exceptions to the rule. So that there is, first off, simply a division, something that in many countries brings everybody together. Rich and poor, different regions, you see each other because of common military service. Not in the US. But moreover, right, some people carry this burden, some don't. Some die, some don't. And it's noticed. So there's a huge wave of militarism going on in the United States right now, in which there are military displays at every college football game, financed by the Pentagon, boosted by various football supporters, right? Because it's linked to recruiting and trying to do this. But part of what's driven it is the all-volunteer army, the fact that there is no mandatory national service, because the elites didn't want mandatory national service. And the non-elites recognize this. And then they're angry at people who seem to be criticizing the military or not respecting it, or you get the idiotic fight over black football players going to one knee during the national anthem, and people saying, you're disrespecting our troops, right? But the need, the battle, the lines are being drawn in part by policies that date back to the 1970s, which were made mainly to spare middle and upper class people from having to be in the military if they didn't want to, having to interrupt their careers. Okay? So it's just one of a variety of ways in which we create a more divided society. Now there are new challenges that we have to face. right? There are huge technological changes going on in the world based on a variety of different technologies. I actually think the biotechnologies are even more important than the artificial intelligence in all of this, right? And so how will we deal with this? And then we have one of the world's allegedly smartest people making the statement that Stephen Hawking made that's quoted here, right? Computers will overtake humans with AI within the next 100 years. Some people think it's within the next 10 or 20. Some people think 100. Some people think it's a really meaningless way to reason about this, but just say 100 years. When that happens, whenever it happens, we need to make sure the computers have goals aligned with ours. And this is the sentence I want to dwell on. What does that mean, aligned with ours? I'm meant to be, I've skipped it to come here, at a conference on the alignment of ethics, alignment of ethical principles between artificial intelligence and humanity, in which the stated goal, led by some very major people from MIT and Cambridge and places, is to have the machines be aligned with human values. And it never occurs to them to say, what human values? The human values that drive us into war, the human values that produce inequality, or perhaps some other human values, right? A very non-self-critical. So we are managing or not managing the transition, the actual approach to managing the transition to a society which will be quite dramatically changed by artificial intelligence, is essentially for governments to do nothing except for finance artificial intelligence and leave it to big tech corporations in Silicon Valley to figure out what should happen. Right? That's not really a policy for making the future, for changing things, in something that will be that important to us. Here's a little AI example. Right? Nobody is going to have the same kind of trust of their own eyes in the world. Already this is an extension of what we saw in the US election in November and other things. But basically, these four pictures, right, are in the upper left-hand corner, right, the original picture actually taken with a camera, right, and three pictures that are altered by artificial intelligence programs, or an artificial intelligence program, which has done machine learning to learn how to do this effective change, right? So that a quite realistic picture of summer is available in the upper right-hand corner, right? It's completely specious, right? It's just an editing of the picture of winter, okay? And the same sort of thing is available for all kinds of things. Evidence in trials. Don't worry, we have a surveillance camera. Well, worry, it's hackable, right? Don't worry, witnesses filmed that with their cameras. Well, worry, right? In a whole range of arenas, this just makes possible the destabilization of something we had confidence in, the vision of our own eyes, right? And applications in various areas. So other big things are happening which are going to be unsettling. And if we aren't working on what makes our societies hold together, it's going to be a problem. For the most part, populist politicians hope that old, previously tried projects will work. If only we could get Britain out of the EU, everything would be okay, right? Isn't clear that that's going to work out in various ways. Populism is full of golden age sorts of stories. Everything used to be good, we should go back to how it is good. The problem, even if it used to be good, actually most of them remember the past falsely, but even if it used to be that good, you can't go back in quite the same way. It's not feasible. But a lot of it is about status hierarchies that are upended. A lot of the issue with Britain is people feeling that Britain would be more important and more powerful in the world if it were outside the EU. I mean, people would say things to me during the Brexit campaign like, we'll really be able to compete with the US after Brexit. How is that going to work, right? Or, right, don't worry, all of our former colonies will trade with us, so we won't miss the trade we got. Also, why would you think that was going to happen the same way? Right? There was a huge sort of love of the empire, a revitalism. We're going to restore the kind of pride we had in the days of the British Empire. And it's going to carry us forward. There are mixtures of sense of a defeatism that comes from feeling that you've lost something great, right? Or a false hope in getting it back that drive lots of these, right? So Viktor Orban is an example not far different from Donald Trump in many ways, actually much more sophisticated than Donald Trump, in fact. Isabella was talking about today, that I think is quite true. Only met each of them once, but based on that extensive empirical research, I can tell you that I think Orban is more sophisticated. But the program is pretty much the same, right? Keep Muslims out, be a Christian country, rein in these liberal intellectuals and universities. Not like that. Make the nation strong, make sure there are more jobs, right? It's a common program, right? The BJP has versions of this in India, anchored on wanting to be living up to India's glory days in various ways. Russia struggles very much with not being as powerful as it was recently, let alone not feeling like it's living up to being the third Rome and the global champion of orthodoxy and all of this. And it deals with this in things that seem unrelated, like highly repressive policies on gay rights. So, okay, how is it that that's going to restore Russian power? But it's not that kind of question, right? It is a question about revitalizing this. China, essentially, same story. China wants to overcome the embarrassing attacks of foreigners and to assuage that historical injury in ways that also make it enormously prosperous for the future. Unlike each of the other countries I just cited, the Chinese also have a very developed discourse under Xi Jinping of a Chinese dream, sort of partially copied from the idea of an American dream, and a powerful, motivating idea. China has announced its plans for becoming the global leader in artificial intelligence within 30 years, in gene editing within 25, and has a whole series of programs that are part of this, but it is also a Chinese dream that is, after all, the dream of the people, right? It's a popular dream in all of this. And we realize it, each of these phrases is carefully chosen in this, both in the original Chinese and in the translation. This is an official Xi Jinping quote, right? We realize it by closely depending on the people, right? The party depends on the people. We must incessantly bring benefits to the people. Realizing the great renewal of the Chinese nation is the greatest dream for the Chinese nation in modern history, right? Now, not sincere, highly motivating, and effective. And one question to ask is, how many Western countries could you imagine conceptualizing a dream like this as a successful political claim? One of the features of populism and nationalism in our era is we are really down at the mouth. We are all about how bad things have gotten, how we're going to make it great again, but not a dream for Hoover, right? Make it great like it was in the 1950s or something, not the new dream in all of that. But China's dream is not democratic. Now on the future of democracy, and I'm about to close and all of that, China's dream is not at all democratic. China is proving and now explicitly saying there is no evolution to democracy. This is not the best system. We are going to build a different system. China in English, this is one of the things that diverges frequently in English and Chinese. China is not committed to that. It used to be very committed to saying it would have democracy with Chinese characteristics, it would have people's democracy, there are various qualifications, but democratic. It's now saying, actually, democracy doesn't look that good. We look at democracy, and we see a lot of problems. We see some very good things in the West that we want to learn from, but that system of elections you have with money running everything doesn't seem to be one of them. Right? If democracy is going to thrive in some Western countries, it's going to be in a world which does not assume there's an evolutionary path to democracy, and in which many of the major countries, including China, one of the most important, will be explicitly not democratic. The old idea that liberal democracy and capitalism went together hand in hand will be sundered. Chinese, largely state capitalism, will be a powerful force in the world. We'll have to rethink this. Right? Now, in this context, is a more responsible nationalism possible? More responsible than just trying to be bellicose and belligerent and tough and bully, right? A nationalism that would say, hey, somebody has to work to make a better global cooperation. We need to deal with climate change. We need to deal with financial architecture and instability. We need to deal with a variety of things that require sharing, right? That could rein in unregulated global capitalism. So far, the EU is really the only political unit that has made any significant effort to try to manage the technology industry and regulate it and tiny so far. The American government has done nothing in relationship to this. So if you want Google and Apple and Microsoft and Facebook to run the world, fine. But if you think that they're democracy, they are not democracies. If you think democracy has a role, you have to ask, democracy where? Democracy in what governmental unit is going to do any of that? And the answer is pretty much a nation. Without nations, there is no friction against global corporate capitalism. I don't mean trying to stop it, I mean trying to regulate it, trying to manage it, trying to make sure that there is some protection of agreed upon rights, of fairness, and so forth. So I think that there are real questions. It would be helpful if there were responsible nationalism. You know, could we get rid of the idea that absolute sovereignty is the goal, in which everybody is isolated and separate, and say the goal is a capacity to defend your domestic efforts to make a better society and to exert influence, but not control, globally through participating. Right? Seems like it ought to be possible. Doesn't look very immediately on the agenda, but seems like. Right? Can democracy alone fix the problems? Really at the end now. Of democratic societies? Well, I've talked through most of this about the problems. I think the jury's out on the fix. We don't just need to have a deeper understanding of populism and nationalism. We need to ask fundamental questions about democracy and about what makes our own societies hold together and work as societies, and what makes international cooperation and mutual dependence work. And they have to be really hard and asked in a serious way. Start with, how can shared political belonging and social integration be achieved? It sounds like a sort of sociology 101 question, except there's no answer in the sociology book. Right? It is a challenge to figure out. We have some ideas, we know some things, we're not doing most of them. How would we create a more effective system of political belonging? How can public spheres become effective in the face of new media technologies? How can we have a reasoned and rational way of making decisions together? And how can we integrate cultural creativity with that rational decision-making? What's a good balance between national sovereignty and global cooperation? Which institutions should be rebuilt completely? Which should be reformed somewhat? Which should be replaced with different institutions? Most countries in the world, and the EU in this case, are completely stuck on the question. Institutions have been under 40 years of erosion, and yet nobody really has any serious program for rebuilding the institutional structures that our lives in common depend on. We'd better get one if we expect to be able to continue to depend on these. And finally, can we really accept this idea that politics and markets have a sharp distinction, that the world is separated into spheres, and these different value spheres, in Max Weber's sense, tell us that we have to maintain this separation, that a de-differentiation would be a disaster. Well, how autonomous should markets and corporations be as they manage dramatic, life-changing technologies, as they shape the economy of the world, as many of them are larger than all but the very largest countries? What is the right solution? Thank you. Too long. Go ahead.
So in the interest of time, I'll just open up immediately to questions. Maybe we'll take 3 or 4 questions together. We'll start right at the back, Shreya, and in the middle.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Sorry. So I have 2 questions probably. The first one is you haven't mentioned a word of online media, and I was thinking that my generation.
Online media.
Yeah, exactly, because you talked about traditional media, and I was thinking that my generation gets politicized and gets socialized politically through Twitter, through Facebook, and things like that. So if you could talk about it. And then the second question would be, to what extent do you see those paradoxes within populism? And I'm thinking in terms because of how Trump's granddaughter speaks fluently Chinese, how Trump is understood and celebrated by the supporters as a international business manager who was very successful in other countries. And I was thinking, would you explain those paradoxes and how people who support him and who support populists are willing to accept those? And then the third question, probably very fast, is on if you think that international education is a way in which to contribute to the democratization or, the fight against populism, I guess.
Hi, thanks so much. This has been fascinating. You started by talking about popular sovereignty, and then you finished, well, not quite, but by mentioning artificial intelligence and even the draft. And in the past 150 years, when we've moved towards, the expansion of the electoral franchise, it happened in part because people first had to fight, and then they had to work. And now we confront a world where drones do the fighting. Or drones and professional armies do the fighting, and our labor may not be necessary to work. Does the political economy for democracy start to wither, and will popular sovereignty still matter?
Everybody want me to stop taking notes?
One more here. We're one more here up front.
Oh, but they give the microphone to somebody back there.
We'll just take this one.
Yeah. No, I'm at ease.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. I would just be interested to hear your take on Mr. Steve Bannon and his particular form of what he would call economic nationalism, and whether he's more a run-of-the-mill kind of guy in his desire to deconstruct the administrative state, or if some of his more peculiar cosmic beliefs about the fourth turning generation theory and like the Thucydides trap with regard to China and how that interacts with everything. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just, in order, go through these. So the first three. Online media, I briefly alluded to. When I said media, I didn't mean just TV or something like that. And it's the changing mediascape. There had been an adaptation of democratic politics to broadcast media and print. I'm not saying it was perfect, right? People were writing critiques of the public sphere then, but there was an adaptation stabilized. The adaptation to social media and other forms, I think online may not be the right thing, but a series of electronic and digital media that work in various ways, has been an uneven one. Obviously, some adapted very effectively and used these media very effectively. The generational differences are striking. And really the reason I sort of equivalent with online or something, the real issue is that using things like email becomes an old person's game in favor of using a variety of more instant messaging dedicated apps. And at least if I judge by my children, that you can keep changing so that your parents can't do the annoying thing and get on there and look at the pictures you have with your friends. And so there is the change in socialization. There's a change in the business model that I think is a bigger deal, and the business model of which media are deployed is a huge issue. There's a change that comes with the vulnerability to hacking. Whatever the outcome of the investigations of Russian hacking in the US election, there is clearly a lot of international hacking, cyber attacks, and things going on. There's the issue of robot-produced fake news. The issue of fake news is not just its fakeness, but the ability to send out tens of millions of exemplars very quickly and so forth. So I think the media issues are enormous. The early hopes that distributed social media would be a democratic paradise because it would make it easier for there to be flow. Everybody could be a sender and a receiver rather than just a receiver from a central message and so forth have been pretty deeply dashed. They were wildly utopian at the beginning. I think something of the same thing is going on, that we're at the transition point with AI. AI for years had a hugely utopian reading of just going from strength to strength in many ways. That would be good for all of us, and it's shifting into a mode of sort of panic. But neither of those really gets it right. In my view, to think in terms of utopia and apocalypse actually crowds out all of the things in the middle which are much more likely to happen than either utopia or apocalypse. And so I think that the media transformations that are underway are going to be very influential. I both don't know all of the ways in which they'll be influential and don't have the time to talk about the ones I think I know something about, but they're considerable in that. And it's not a one-time transition that is over, in which you'd say, oh, well, like we've invented TV and that'll last for 50 years. We're in the middle of a major reorganization of a whole ecology. And to repeat the point I made about business model, one of the biggest things that's happening in this reorganization is a change in who owns and controls what aspects of the communications process. And then how would they be regulated? So in the US, net neutrality has been lost, but it remains a question, is it conceivable that there could be a shift in the approach to understanding social media, which says they are like publishers, in which case they have responsibility, and when they behave recklessly can be sued or whatever, or are they just like the maintainers of print shops, which cannot be sued for the content of what they print? And that's an unsettled question. Trump's granddaughter, really popular in China. They loved her. Trump's more popular there than in the US, which doesn't mean that they're going to take him in, unfortunately. The paradox is a good word for this. So Trump is a masterful businessman in certain ways, as a promoter of his own image. Even his hotel business and all these other things are not so much a business at doing something else, but a business of being him and branding all of these things, which he did successfully and at all this. The granddaughter's enrolled in a Chinese immersion program at school, which is a fad that is spreading. There are lots of these in the US, in Europe, and other places, so lots of grandchildren are getting immersed in Chinese on the assumption that we are headed for a shift from US hegemony to Chinese hegemony in the global world system. I wouldn't take that for granted. The rise of China is enormously important, but China has not yet reached the level of a third of the US GDP per capita. And it's harder to get the last part of that increase than the first part. So China's becoming much more powerful and important. That's a big deal, but I'm not sure that it's going to automatically be instantaneous. However, all this teaching of Chinese is soft power in Zhou Nai's sense. And it is a successful transition in which the rest of the world, by believing in China's rising strength and relative beneficence, is actually helping to make some of that happen. It's sort of participating in it. So it's an interesting process there. I'm a strong believer in international education, though I'd note in this, as in everything else, I'm one of those tedious bores who says it depends on how it's organized. International education can simply mean privilege for global elites to be able to go to highly ranked institutions, and even more exclusion, right? So if within countries, hierarchies meant that some people got a less good chance, when the hierarchies go global, that effect is even bigger. So which international education do we mean? When I was a student, it meant things like going to spend a year abroad, or I actually got to go do my doctorate in England. It means now boarding schools have franchise operations. Eton, for example, has opened Asian franchise campuses of this enormously influential British prep school in order to get wealthy Asian kids into English and American universities. It's a business. It's organized, and so it has the outcomes of that. It's not an idealistic sharing of international knowledge, but it is creating a global cosmopolitan elite. I think it's probably good to have an elite that is cosmopolitan, that thinks of the world as a whole, but I think we should be conscious it is still a very narrow elite, and plays that way. AI, yeah, AI could take over war, although there's the question of if AI is getting good enough to do it, would AI want it anymore, since it would presumably replace the generals and the politicians too? But the question is real. So AI has huge potentials. There is a lot of expectation of it putting lots of people out of work, including soldiers. The U.S. Pentagon has invested very heavily in AI, the Chinese People's Liberation Army even more heavily. And this is mostly, however, in versions of the technology designed to enhance human capacity, not replace humans. There are replacements like drone aircraft, but there's also an awful lot of enhancement of things that still involve humans in part of the system. But it's all a matter of choices. Again, it is entirely conceivable that we replace large parts of the human workforce and the human military and render popular sovereignty redundant and therefore create a transition to a society in which there is very little value placed on human beings. Some of you may have read Yuval Harari's Sapiens and Homo Deus, which have been extremely popular works they're popular history. They're not sort of serious academic work, but they're well done popular history, very popular with leaders of Silicon Valley and others, which simply say 80% or more of the human race is going to become redundant within the next 30 years. And because of the power of the technologies, which nobody need. And there the question is how to manage those redundant people without having a revolution. And maybe that's the question. I think there are a lot more choices before us than that in terms of how we use the technologies and what work we create. There seems to be no intrinsic reason we couldn't do things like pay school teachers decent wages and hire more of them. We don't seem to have the political will to do that the business, but there are a variety of things that we could do in the context of AI contributed wealth generation. Steve Bannon, interesting guy. Never met him, have no inside information on this, so a relatively uninformed answer. He gives me the opportunity to say better than I would say with Trump. It is a mistake to, and many leftish or left-ish intellectuals have made the mistake of wanting to make fun of populist and nationalist leaders, and particularly the right-wing populist and nationalist leaders of various kinds, and to think they're stupid. I don't think they're stupid. I think making fun of them is silly. I think this is just not going to do it. That doesn't mean you can't have a good laugh when Trump says something outrageous. It means you are very unwise to imagine that Trump's popularity is going to be determined entirely by that. I remember during the George W. Bush presidency when there were lots of people saying, it's outrageous, he was a C student at Yale. And I'm thinking, this is going to persuade the American people that being a C student at Yale disqualifies him? They didn't get into Yale, most of the American people. It just was a very strange elitist answer. So with Steve Bannon, I think Steve Bannon is extremely intelligent. I think he has a somewhat serious, not so much intellectual, but an intellectually informed program about policy engagement in all of this. The Fourth Turning stuff is all derivative and borrowed from the author of The Fourth Turning, and a sort of belief in that. It's not very historically strong by comparison to really serious academic history, but it's way more history than most people know, and it's not all false. I think the synthesis and conclusions are misleading, but it gives him a sort of grip on a bigger picture, which very few people in Congress or in other major media settings have. So I think part of his strength is that he has that sort of grip on a bigger picture and is able to use it effectively as a media figure, combining Breitbart with more tactical sorts of things. So I don't think he's going to be able to completely recast American politics and do all that he wants, but I think he is a serious player in some sense in this. Finally, the Thucydides trap's a completely different story from the Fourth Turning, all of this. I mean, Fourth Turning has no reputable, serious academic intellectuals who take it seriously. Thucydides trap certainly does, with people like Graham Allison or others who are arguing much the same sort of case about the likelihood of conflict with China. Graham Allison doesn't relish it as much as Steve Bannon. He thinks it would be a bad thing if it happened, but he thinks that the odds are it's going to happen, whereas there seems to be more mischievous delight in Steve Bannon. But I think the Thucydides trap argument is to be taken seriously. I think it's not to be assumed uncritically that it's correct, but it is to be analyzed. This is just the argument that when there is a declining power and a rising power, that conflict between them is extremely likely. And then there are a bunch of further specifications about why, in this case of China and the U.S., it's likely. It's enormously popular in China, not because of Steve Bannon, but because of Thucydides, but and Graham Allison knows. But there's actually a Chinese author who wrote a book on the Thucydides trap, 2005, if I remember rightly, and helped to make it popular in China as an account of what China has to avoid in its doing the West. That China needs to get richer, get more powerful, and avoid a conflict with the West. And that's been a guiding idea in China for a number of years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg, for this wide-ranging talk and the discussion. Thank you for being with us this evening. It's been a long day for those of us who've been at the conference, so I hope I haven't overlooked anybody's questions here. And that is our last public lecture from the Hirschman Center for this year, and we'll see you on the 19th of February. For those of you who are following our program, we have Chantal Mouffe talking about democracy, fear, and passion.
When I started.